It is fascinating just how many people are involved in the designing, construction, and operation of maritime vehicles. Whether they are built for military, fishing, passenger or cargo movement purposes, the amount of materials used to ensure that these boats take to the sea and carry out their purpose is a colossal feat to be admired. It is therefore no wonder that those tasked with the responsibility to navigate, manage, and captain oceanic vessels, especially those of a large nature, are thoroughly vetted and qualified for such a position. So why is it that 423 people perished back in the late 1980s due to a failure of understanding and sheer laziness on behalf of the SS Admiral Nakhimov? Launched in March of 1925, the SS Admiral Nakhimov was a passenger liner of the German Weimar Republic, which would later become a passenger ship of the Soviet Union. On the 31st of August, 1986, the ship would come into contact with another bulk carrier named Pyotr Vasev, and despite ongoing communications, both ships would crash into each other in the Tsemes Bay, near the port of Novorossiysk, one of the largest ports in the Black Sea, and quickly sank. Of the 1,234 people on board, a total of 423 perished that day. How could such a tragedy occur? Why did the ships collide if they had been communicating beforehand? What was the aftermath, and who was held responsible? Join us for another episode of Maritime Mishaps, where we will discuss these questions and much, much more. As with any maritime disaster, one must look at the events, actions, and history of the ships themselves, as well as the appointed authoritative figures in charge of the ships, which have encountered danger or sank to the bottom of our oceans. The SS Berlin was built by the Bremer Vulcan, a prominent German shipbuilding company located at the Weser River in Bremen, and was completed in March of 1925. The ship was officially launched on the 25th of March and fully commissioned on the 17th of September. She was 572 feet long and consisted of 4 decks with a gross register tonnage of 15,286 tons. Before she became a passenger liner, the Berlin was one of only 8 German structures commissioned as hospital ships during World War II. In 1946, at the end of the war, work began on the boat whereby the Emergency Rescue Service of the Baltic Fleet updated the lifting mechanics. During its ascent on New Year's Eve, 1947, her bow rose above the surface of the water and exploded, resulting in the ship sinking. At the time of the blast, Timofey Starchenko, a diver, was pushed down and trapped at the bottom of the ship. He was fixing a leak in one of the aft compartments, but managed to eventually escape through a specially designed tunnel which had been constructed. After new repairs commenced, the steamer was renamed SS Admiral Nakhimov in honor of Admiral Pavel Nakhimov, a 19th century Russian naval commander who played a prominent role in the Crimean War. Unfortunately for those on board, though, even with the name of a revered maritime expert, the vessel could not avoid the ultimate tragedy lurking in the open waters. The doomed vessel would set sail from Novorossiysk towards the large city resort of Sochi at 10 p.m. on August 31st, 1986. It is noted that the majority of those on board were Ukrainian. The remaining parties were from other parts of Russia and countries within the Soviet Union. Amongst them were 23 children who were fast asleep at the time. The captain of the ship was Vadim Markov, who was overseeing the journey. Not long after the Nakhimov departed, the ship's pilot noticed a large bulk carrier in the distance. The ship was called the Pyotr Vasev and was seemingly headed straight towards them. The Pyotr Vasev was a Japanese-built 18,000-ton freighter, which had recently been collected and assigned duties by the Soviet Union as well. Its purpose on that evening was to transport oats and barley from Canada. After the pilot noticed that the head-on collision was inevitable, he sent out a radio signal to warn his counterparts of the potential disaster. The freighter replied, "Don't worry, we will pass clear of each other. We will take care of everything." This was their first mistake. After the message was transmitted back to the Admiral Nakhimov, Captain Viktor Tachenka of Pyotr Vasev did absolutely nothing to change the direction of his cargo ship, nor did he give any orders to his crewmen to slow the vessel down. The ignorance of Captain Tachenka and his belief that the freighter would bypass the ongoing ship would ultimately lead to disaster. Captain Markov was also naive enough to put his trust in his fellow captain, and so left his post to retire to his cabin, leaving second mate Alexander Chinovsky in charge. Unconvinced that all was well and avoidant of danger, Chinovsky radioed the Pyotr Vasev on several occasions, starting at 11 p.m., trying to obtain information on their rerouted course. After receiving no feedback, the second mate altered the Nakhimov's course by 10 degrees portside, and at 11:10 p.m., Chinovsky noticed that his actions were not enough to prevent a collision. He grabbed the VHF marine radio one last time and screamed, "Immediately, reverse full astern." At this point, the Pyotr Vasev's engines were thrown into reverse, but it would be too late. At 11:12 p.m., the Admiral Nakhimov was struck by Pyotr Vasev 8 nautical miles from the port at Novorossiysk and 2 nautical miles from shore at approximately 5 knots, or 5.8 miles per hour. The ship pushed forward with the freighter's bow tearing a 900 square foot hole in the hull between her engine and boiler rooms. Upon impact, the lights shut off briefly before the emergency diesel generator attempted to regain power. However, a few minutes later, the generator would shut off completely, leaving everyone on board scrambling around the decks and cabins in total darkness. The remote closing of the watertight bulkhead doors did not work due to the loss of power, and so the ship began to sink. Terrified guests and personnel made their way towards the lifeboats in panic, but there was no time to launch them. Older davits were destroyed by corrosion, which rendered them useless at this point. Only one lifeboat was deployed and accessible, and therefore, a total of 32 out of 48 life rafts were tossed into the waters in the hope that people would latch onto them. There was chaos on board. People were screaming. Others were crying or nervously laughing. Men were lighting Zippos and matchsticks. Recalled Yekaterina Kishman, one of the survivors. Another survivor, just named Vladimir, stated, "I jumped and with all my strength was trying to swim away from the sinking ship to avoid being sucked into the whirlpool. I looked back and saw how the ship went down, and I was dragged down as well. I wanted so much to live, and I struggled so hard to get to the surface. And I made it. I took off my shirt, trousers, and shoes. I realized that the stream was taking me to the open sea." In the end, it took only 7 minutes for the Admiral Nakhimov to sink. Within the next 10 minutes, 20 helicopters and 64 rescue ships were deployed and began their rescue mission, one of which was the Pyotr Vasev itself, which was actually not severely damaged in the collision. In total, 836 people were pulled from the water. As for the Admiral Nakhimov itself, she lies on her starboard side, under 150 feet of water, into Tsemes Bay. As if the sinking of the Admiral Nakhimov and the deaths of those on board isn't tragic enough, the complications and issues concerning the ill-fated liner were still not over as, during the investigative aftermath, disaster would strike again. Not long after the initial sinking, divers from the Black Sea Shipping Company scheduled a customized rescue vessel called SS-21 to head to the scene of the incident. The reconnaissance drivers of the 17th Special Forces Brigade of the Black Sea Fleet were also urgently dispatched to assist with the rescue mission, something that immediately proved difficult as she laid overturned under the waters of the Tsemes Bay. Due to the severity of the sinking and its colossal structure, the divers split into pairs and began inspecting the wreckage. During the night, Lieutenant Commander Igor Ivlev and Midshipman Yuri Polishuk, who were experienced divers nonetheless, spent a long time navigating through the sunken vessel, installing explosives to break through some of the doors, which had swollen due to the pressures of the water. As the men were heading back through the corridors, Polishuk lost consciousness due to the air supply running too low. Just as he was approaching the surface, he fell out of the diving gazebo and drifted back down into the water. His colleagues were quick to notice their fallen friend and quickly jumped into the water to save him. They managed to drag him back to the surface and straight into a pressure chamber in a desperate attempt to save his life. Despite the best efforts by his shipmates and doctors on board, Yuri Polishuk did not regain consciousness and sadly passed away on September 10, 1986. The incident prompted authorities and diver associates to ensure that any future dives using diving equipment with a strong supply of breathing mixture through a hose from the ship, especially when diving into lower decks of sunken vessels. Unfortunately, the cursed liner claimed yet another life on September 19th. This tragedy befell midshipman Sergei Alexandrovich Shardakov as he attempted to break into the 41st cabin, where reports and eyewitnesses claimed that children were locked inside. Shardakov got tangled in his cabling apparatus whilst trying to open the door with his crowbar. The hose used to ventilate his diving suit closed up and he quickly fell unconscious. Similar to the previous incident, his partner managed to get him out of the water and onto the rescue ship's corridor. However, the brave diver would pass away before medical help arrived. During these harrowing attempts at evidence gathering and retrieval, divers were able to salvage materials and pull bodies from the sunken ship. Unfortunately, due to the extreme heat, the bodies of those who perished were so weathered and decayed that identifying them became an almost impossible task. Photographs were taken and examinations were conducted, but it is noted that both divers and doctors involved in the immediate investigations became depressed and suffered from nervous breakdowns due to the atrocities they had witnessed. The deaths of Yuri Polishuk and Sergei Alexandrovich Shardakov prompted the authorities at the Government Commission to cease surveying operations of the SS Admiral Nakhimov, and so all divers were pulled from their duties. As with any maritime disaster, investigations were authorized by the Soviet government. A commission of inquiry was formed to examine and discuss the tragic events, and to determine where to attribute blame. After lengthy discussions, investigative reports, and evidence examination, the commission concluded unsurprisingly that both Captain Markov and Captain Tichenko were responsible for the violation of navigational safety rules. Both men were found equally guilty of shipwreck, loss of life, and sentenced to 15 years of prison each. They would be released early in 1992. Upon release, Markov worked as a captain mentor in the Black Sea Shipping Company and lived in the city of Odessa, where he died in 2007. Mr. Tichenko would immediately move abroad to start a new life after he was released. However, in September of 2003, he would be pronounced dead after a mysterious yacht crash near the coast of Canada. In the years that followed the sinking, the SS Admiral Nakhimov would later become known as the Soviet Titanic due to the events and lives claimed. Such a disaster was unthinkable back then, and even more so nowadays, and yet it happened anyway. Of the 423 people who died that fateful night, 359 were passengers and 64 were crew members. And I'm sure we can all agree that it is 423 too many. In today's age of technology, navigational expertise, and ability to track, trace, and rescue those on board sea ships, we tend to forget just how lucky we are. Unfortunately, those who died on the 31st of August, 1986, did not have the resources and computer-based infrastructure we take for granted today. If they did, many more lives would inevitably have been spared. We hope that this tragic tale of the SS Admiral Nakhimov sheds more light on what happens not just on the seas at home, but on the terrors of maritime travel abroad as well.